experience that the provider wants to give to their user, the research that we may do to understand the user's needs, the design efforts to create that experience. And so that's what we do. And I gave a talk recently at a conference called Fail Early or Fail Large, Embrace Negative Results to Ensure Success. And as I looked at that talk, I thought there's a lot of similarities and resonance between that and the Zen path. So with your permission, I'm going to kind of explore that concept in parallel a little bit. I'm going to bounce back and forth between the software development and UX world and the Zen path. So let me give a quick summary of the talk, and I'll try to do it briefly and not be too boring. But as you do with a talk, you want to capture everybody's attention with kind of a hook in the title, like fail early. Who wants to fail? Why do you want to fail? Everybody wants success. We want to avoid failure. Why would we want to do that? And I started the talk with an example of a big disaster, the Mars Climate Explorer. This was back in the 90s, where we built a spacecraft, sent it to Mars. It was a great success. Flew all the way to Mars. It was a success until it crashed into the surface. The reason it crashed into the surface instead of going into orbit was a user pattern behavioral problem that was not discovered in time. One team was calculating in imperial units, the other one was calculating in the metric system. And nobody checked to see if everything was being consistent, and that led to this problem. So I then went to a similar program. I was working for Lockheed Martin at the time. That's one of the reasons I chose that example. It was a Lockheed project, but not one that I was working on. And I was working in supplier quality assurance. It was my job to make sure that our vendors were making everything the way we specified them. And I found a problem in the program. And I was kind of proud of myself. I'd done my job, right? I was supposed to look for problems, find them early, and I found one. And everybody was unhappy with me, which kind of shocked me a little bit. I had slowed down production. I had pointed out a problem in somebody else's work, and all these negative things, right, that people naturally want to avoid. Those of us who have been involved in projects know that project plans are typically built on best case scenarios. Everything's going to go great, so we're not going to budget a lot of money for running long, overflows, problems, failures, things like that. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And I think a lot of it stems from, we don't like to face problems. We don't like to face failures. In the pre-pandemic days, when I had an office, in the back of my office, I had a chart, we call it the Cognitive Bias Codex. And it was a list of 180, I think it was, different ways that we fool ourselves. And these are patterns to shortcut and speed up thinking so that we could respond rapidly enough when a dangerous animal is approaching. And most of the time in our evolutionary history, they served us well. There were then, and even more so now, times when they don't serve us so well. And one that most everybody is familiar with is confirmation bias, right? To things that validate our thinking. So that's one that we have to watch out for quite a lot. And a stakeholder in Lockheed Martin one time said something that really caught my attention. He said, a bad idea, beautifully executed, is still a bad idea. So that's an example of what I will call a wake-up moment, right? Something that kind of catches your attention. And we're familiar with this in Zen, right? We have lots of stories of those kinds of wake-up moments. And I want to talk about how to find those, how to intentionally look for those. And it's a lot of times a failure, when you face it head on, when you really look at it and not try to avoid it or write it off, those can be real wake-up moments for us, whether it's hardware testing like I found, or software testing, or testing our experience in life, which is a lot of what we're doing in our Zen practice. Those wake-up moments can be really helpful for us. So we can prepare fertile ground to have those kinds of moments if we do it intentionally. How do we do that? I want to, pardon me while I go through my notes. I'm not used to doing this. So there are times when we get, whether it's something happens or somebody says something, it just resonates so clearly. And I'll give you an example of one of my favorite ones. Everybody can have their own, of course. And it can be a real road sign that is worth paying attention to. So one of my favorite fascicles is Genjo Koan. And I read it very often. And one of my favorite lines is early on, kind of in what you might call the preamble, where Dogen says, "Those who have great realization of delusion are Buddhas. Those who are greatly deluded about realization are sentient beings." So now what does that mean? When he refers to Buddhas, that means, obviously, Buddhas, the name means the awakened ones, those who found or realized enlightenment. And sentient beings are the rest of us, those who have not yet. So let's look at that statement again. Those who have great realization of delusion are Buddhas, not those who have found nirvana, found enlightenment are Buddhas. Those who have great realization of delusion are Buddhas. Those who are greatly deluded about realization are sentient beings. And what that's telling me is where we need to put our focus. We need to put our focus on delusion, making sure that we realize it, we recognize it, we understand it when it happens, which, you know, if we talk about experimentation and testing and failures, that's where we see delusion, where we're fooling ourselves, right? If we're greatly deluded about realization, I read that as being very focused on, I've got to find enlightenment, I've got to find nirvana, you know, which direction is that in? Let me go there and find it. So when something hits me like that, quote, did, or always does, I try to just be still and listen to it and see what it's trying to tell me so that I can resonate in harmony with its meaning. So what was Dogen saying? What is he trying to tell us? So, and again, I'm going to meander a little bit. And by the way, I'm using that word intentionally. One of our Sangha members, Keisei Andrew Dietz, wrote a delightful book, Follow the Meander, which talks about these kinds of things a lot, and I highly recommend it. So I'm borrowing a bit from some of his work here. In Zazen Shin, Dogen said, "The water is clear to the earth, a fish is swimming like a fish. The sky is vast, extending to the heavens, a bird is flying like a bird." And the meaning of that is that every creature lives in its element, right? It moves in its element. So what is our element? And that's not a simple question, right? There's an old quote, we don't know who discovered water, but we're pretty sure it wasn't a fish. And I actually found that in one of my design materials that I work in for professional work. And the meaning there is that it's hard to see a medium when you're living in it, when you're surrounded by it. The old saying of, you don't see the forest for the trees, right? You're so immersed in it, you cannot see it. So back to the question of what is our element that we live in? Is it samsara? Is it nirvana? Can we simply choose to find or go to nirvana? Setting aside the question of, are those two separate things? And we'll get back to that later. And so we can't skip to the end, is something that I've learned so many times in so many different ways. We can't just go find enlightenment. Hojo said in the original Frontier, in Zen, we do not pursue such goals. Okamura Roshi said, Soto Zen is the, in quotes, no enlightenment school. In design, which is again an area where I work, we can have a vision of the end point, but if we go there, if we go immediately there, we run the risk of confirmation bias, that old, how much do you love this thing I made, which is what so much of, you know, testing looks like. It's really looking for confirmation, right? But without testing and feedback, you'll be off the mark and even risk missing it completely. And I think the same is true with the Buddhist path. To quote Okamura Roshi again, he said that we have to turn samsara into nirvana, which again is that allusion to they're not two separate things. In design, we talk a lot about the material that we're working with, understanding the material, understanding how it behaves, what you can do with it. I think there's some relationship to that there. It's samsara is something that we work with, right, to turn it into nirvana. So to do that, you know, in terms of that design metaphor, working with materials, you have to learn how to work with it, right? So, so what does that mean for us in the Zen life? And again, Hojo in the original Frontier said, the Zen life, especially Zazen itself, is best conducted as an open-ended experiment. Shohaku Okamura in Realizing Genjo Koan says, when we give all of our attention and energy to the task or practice before us, we can truly penetrate it. We work on the practice, study it, experiment with it, and care for it. We do this over and over and over again with whatever we encounter, one thing at a time, each time. And we see this in other areas as well. For example, in I believe it's Tenzo Kyokun Dogen's Instructions for the Cook, right? It's focusing in on the Tenzo's role on cooking, on preparing food, feeding the Sangha, how to do that with care and attention. So with this in mind, I want to talk a little bit about how to approach experimentation in general, and how do we do that in our Zen practice. So an experiment requires a hypothesis, right? It's a statement of reality that can be tested, and both of those are very important. It's not a hypothetical, it's something that hopefully has some real meaning, and that it can be tested, you know, proven or disproven, or not necessarily a digital prove or disprove, but also expand our understanding of something with additional learning. So what could be our hypotheses that we could work with in our Zen practice? So those of you who have heard me talk in other talks know that I like to examine meanings of teachings. I like to look at them from different angles. For example, in the fall retreat, I spoke of the Four Noble Truths instead of being nouns and truth statements as being tasks, action statements, something you can do. So what I'd like to propose now is that we could look at the Four Noble Truths as four hypotheses, four statements about reality that you could test for yourself and evaluate. So to do that, you know, how would we do that? How would we run an experiment on those hypotheses? So you need to have a method, right? You need to have the question to apply the method to. You will attain some results that you can evaluate against criteria. So for each one of those, what would those be in our path? So the questions would be those hypotheses. Is this valid or not? The method would be Zazen. is how we evaluate our lives. And I don't mean that as okay, I'm going to sit down and think about this, but but Zazen kind of reveals those types of things, the results, the impacts of our behavior, as we clear our minds of our preconceived notions. And then the criteria is an interesting question. How do we evaluate that? And I put forward the precepts as those criteria. And Brad Warner says the precepts are standards by which to judge our behavior in Zen wrapped in karma, dipped in chocolate, I think it is. So when I apply that metaphor, and again, metaphors work for if it's a comparison to something that resonates for you, that understands for you. And this metaphor may not work for everyone, but it really resonates strongly with me because it lines up with my professional life. I mean, I started out as a physics student in experimental physics. So from physics through engineering, through project management and management of people, where the experiment is trying different organizational techniques, things like that. Does this work? Does it not? People may not think about that as experimentation, but it can be very much so. And now in user experience design, this is a recurring theme in my life of take a hypothesis, test it, see the results, evaluate the results. Did it work as expected or not? What is reality? And is it what you expected or not? So to continue the metaphor, I came up with, 3 very high level takeaways in this conference talk that I gave. And the first one was that you should smile, don't groan at test fails, which is surprising. So many people do groan. I had in that talk, I had a quote from one of the members of my team at the time. She said she had found a test failure, so to speak, negative results. And she said, I was terrified to present the results. And that was an absolutely valid statement. You have to go tell your client, a designer, an engineer, a developer, whoever, or a team of them, that their idea didn't work. Maybe it was a bad idea, beautifully executed. Go back to that quote. We've heard a lot of phrases like, it's really hard to tell somebody their baby is ugly, kind of a rude phrase, but it really hits home, right? That's very hard for people to accept. And so that's very hard for most of us to do, to even present those findings. So one of the things we have to learn is to smile when we get those negative results, because we just learned something valuable, maybe even prevented disaster. So Shohaku Okumura said, when we make a mistake, we penetrate that mistake and learn from it. Then our mistakes become great teachers for us. And that's a recurring theme in teachings throughout, all the way back to the Buddha, that our mistakes, failures, our enemies can be our greatest teachers. Okay, when life's wonderful, a slide I used in my presentation was, when you get positive results, it's all unicorns and rainbows. Everybody's happy, right? But you don't learn much from that. You learn much, much more about the reality of the world when things go wrong. The next major takeaway was then, first, don't block it, accept it. And then the second one is really take it to heart. The harder it is to hear, the more you need to listen, okay? And again, back to those kinds of quotes from the teachings that really, really resonate with me. Another favorite of mine from Dogen is, to study the Buddha way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. To forget the self is to be actualized by myriad things. So, the modern day translation of that for me in terms of the UX design presentation was, when you're studying the self, when you're becoming aware of your reactions, when you're getting in the way, when you need to back off, drop your shields, and listen. The other major takeaway was to actively plan for testing, and iteration is a word we use a lot in that world, to test, see the results, adjust, and then go through that cycle again. The reason you have to plan for failure is that if you don't plan for failure, failure will happen unplanned. And we all know that. That's life, right? But if you can, and you can't plan for everything, but you can certainly plan for some things. And when I say plan, I don't mean plan necessarily to avoid problems. I mean, we certainly want to do that where we can. But in this case, in this context, I'm talking about planning a little experiment to intentionally learn something. So again, the questions that we want to learn about, what are those? Well, I don't think I'm going to revise that statement in my head here. The large questions come to us every day, right? That's just unavoidable. To go back over the experimentation method, right? So the questions are the things that arise in daily life, but we can also pick particular questions, right? We can look at the precepts and we can narrow it down to a very small focus. So for example, just one small example in terms of things like, and I'm going to kind of bounce back and forth between the precepts and the Eightfold Path and things like that. If we look at right speech, right, you could say, well, I'm going to try and practice right speech all day. That's cool. Please do. Go ahead. I do that, and that's one that's very hard to work on, right? It takes a lot of practice, but you can also narrow it down to little individual pieces to experiment with and say, what will it be like if I try to go all day and not talk about someone who is not present, right? That's an interesting little experiment. And what you can learn is that really makes it easy to avoid gossip, for example. So we can make all kinds of little experimental tests like that. Think about what we want to investigate, what we think we may need to work on. When I talk about the method being Zazen, to me, that's kind of an automatic. It's not something we have to try to do. Zazen's different in different sessions. It's different for different people, but I think some things are universal in that as we are dropping off body and mind, or to use the 21st century phrase, dropping shields, some things become obvious. It's like, oh, what I said in this meeting, I saw somebody's reaction, and if I had to do that over again, if I had that opportunity, I would state that differently or something like that. That's why I call that the method. We can really see the impacts of our experiments. The criteria that we're examining against are the precepts, and I would take it all the way up to the 3 pure precepts. Have we done harm? Have we caused suffering for self and others? Things like that. And the results, that's for, at the end of the day, that's for you to evaluate. Which behaviors reduce suffering and which behaviors do not or add to suffering. So in my life, and again, I think I mentioned this earlier, it seems to be a recurring theme for me, being an experimental physics student, working in engineering, managing people, project management, now working in design, with my Zen practice. That recurring theme of take a hypothesis, test it, see what it's telling me about reality has been extremely helpful and valuable. So if we go back to the fish quote, right, about we don't know who discovered water, but we're pretty sure it wasn't a fish. That would be a fish who's swimming around aimlessly without intentionally trying to understand their medium, right? However, if we practice awareness, if we practice letting go of our preconceived notions, practicing reality as it is, then we can learn the true nature of the realm of our experience, of our medium, of our fish that water that we swim in, or the air that we fly in. And again, we can go back to the teachings and see where the great teachers have told us this. Dogen said, when the transient nature of the world is recognized, the ordinary selfish mind does not arise. This is in Hotsu Bodaishin, arising the aspiration to enlightenment. He doesn't talk about when, we've awakened, achieved nirvana or anything like that. He talks about when the transient nature of the world is recognized, the ordinary selfish mind does not arise. If we go back before that to Nagarjuna, we had learned more about him in the previous talk. He said, the mind that sees into the flux of arising and decaying and recognizes the impermanent nature of the world is also known as the mind that aspires to enlightenment. Okay. Again, he's not talking about, if I find the right direction, if I head towards enlightenment, I will get there. He says, the mind that sees into the flux of arising and decaying and recognizes the impermanent nature of the world. Okay. And to me, that's all about seeing when things don't work as we expect them to, or as we want them to. That's why I use the word fail in the title, right? Focusing on samsara, as we might call it, right? When things don't go the way we want it to, we call it samsara. But by focusing on that and understanding that, that's how we really move in the right direction towards realizing nirvana. And I use that phrase intentionally when I say moving in the right direction. Okay. That starts to touch on that challenging topic of, well, how do you move in the right direction if you don't have a goal, right? If you look at the wording in Hotsu Bodaishin, they talk about arising the mind that aspires to enlightenment. They don't talk about achieving enlightenment. They talk about aspiring or arising the aspiration to enlightenment, setting the direction. Back to the book Follow the Meander, right? One of the reasons I love that metaphor is that, and by the way, meander, one of the things he points out was that that word came from the name of a river. And we all know the river will hit a rock and it'll set up a current, and that'll carve out an oxbow in the river and things like that. And it'll just kind of meander all over the place. But a river also inexorably flows downstream towards the ocean, right? There is an overarching direction. And in our practice, the way we do that is by seeing into the flux of arising and decaying, realizing the transient nature of the world. So to me, that translates into really diving into the reality of our life, into those little failures, right? What we typically call samsara, when things don't go the way we want them to. Really embracing that, and not in a haphazard, aimless way, but with an intention to understanding why we find it challenging or painful, or why things didn't happen the way we expected. And it always comes back to ourselves, our expectations, our desires and preconceived notions. I think that's one of the reasons that Matsuoka Roshi added the story of the prodigal son to the Jukai ceremony, right? That was a modern adaptation that he did. This is something that Hojo mentioned in one of his recent podcasts, is that is the story of somebody who had everything that he aspired to, and I'm not going to repeat the whole story, but had to go on a long journey of losing it and seeing the pain of life before being able to re-find it. For those who may not be familiar with that story, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, there's a a more modern analogy that you may be familiar with, I like the Tin Man in The Wizard of Oz, right? He wanted to find a heart. His end goal was, I need to go somewhere else and get a heart. And he went through this journey. And at the end of the journey, he realized he had a heart the whole time, but he needed the journey and the experiences and the challenges of that journey to make that to build that awareness in himself. And I would say also to give him practice in using it and in experiencing it and knowing what a heart is and what to do with it. So to try and wrap up this meander, this ramble, we can't skip to the end, whether it's a physics experiment or a design. We can go skip to the end and build it exactly as we designed it, but that's not going to be 100% effective. And we can't skip straight ahead to nirvana. There's just no way to do that, because samsara and nirvana are not two. There is no other place to skip to. We have to, back to those quotes from Dogen and Nagarjuna, we have to deeply immerse ourselves in this medium where we are right now, in our realm, to understand it. So my title was Failing to Find Enlightenment. And again, back to playing with words. That title can have two different meanings depending on where you put the pause. It can be failing to find what? Failing to find enlightenment. Or it can be failing to find enlightenment. And that means that failing is a technique to help you find enlightenment. And I prefer the second meaning. Zen encourages to do this in general, to explore ambiguities, to explore paradoxes, to go beyond words. And that's what I tried to do a little bit here. That's what I encourage you to do. So may you be well, may you be happy, may you fail often, and may you learn from those failures.
Thank you so much, Kosetsu, for your teaching. And now comes the part to further expand with questions, comments. And again, folks on Facebook and online and in the Zendo, come off mute, raise your hands. We welcome comments, and Kosetsu is here. He and I are both facilitators, so he may catch your hand up before I do. But
I see Ungan's hand up.
Yes, Ungan.
That was amazing, Kosetsu. You don't happen to have that in like the form of an essay, do you?
Well, I will say that I was planning to write it out and make it available as such. So I do not yet.
I strongly encourage you to do so. I think that was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you for your encouragement.
Yep. Sensei Shinjin.
Kosetsu, that was a fantastic talk. Thank you. One of the questions that kept coming up to me when you kept talking about results not going the way you wanted them, and how that kind of represented failure. And I was wondering if you could relate that process to attachment.
So I'm not quite picking up the microphone. Can I relate that process to what?
Attachment.
Attachment.
To the second noble truth.
Okay. When things aren't going the way you expect them to. So one of the things I mentioned, the cognitive bias codex, and one of the things that helps us avoid our attachments is being aware of them, knowing what they are, right? So researchers as well as the participants, I mean, let me rephrase that. We have to be careful as researchers not to assume that only the participants are fooling themselves. We have to be very aware of the fact that we can be fooling ourselves. That's why in the experimental world and in published papers and such, they always very carefully describe their technique, right? So that it can be replicated or somebody can find an error in it. And in the context I'm talking about here, we are all researchers. We are all, to study the way is to study the self. So we need to be aware of the ways that we can fool ourselves. And the teachings are full of those kinds of stories. And I think that's what we do for each other as Sangha members, right? I love the metaphor of we kind of like stones in a riverbed, we kind of knock against each other on our path, and we knock the rough edges off each other and kind of come up with this beautiful, rounded, smooth stone that we can very gently help show each other how we're fooling ourselves. So that, to me, is a very critical part of not just saying, okay, I want to ask this question, I want to run this experiment. It's very easy to say, I want to show this result. And believe me, I very often have said that, oh, I really hope this is the result that I see. And I have to watch myself, and make sure that I'm not doing the analysis in the way to ignore the data that I don't like and to emphasize the data that I do like, because there's not always, a hard and fast yes or no answer. The same thing is true, and I find this whenever I do one of these talks, is when I'm looking at a quote and I want to cherry pick a quote, right? I have to be very careful not to take it out of context. It's easy to find a sentence or two that says the words that I think make the point I want to make, but I have to look very carefully at, is that what this is saying in context, really? So I don't know if I'm answering your question or not, but I think we always need to be very, very careful about, are we looking at, how we might be fooling ourselves?
That was a great answer. Because you use the example from The Wizard of Oz. There's another way to tell that story too. A young woman murders upon entering a surreal landscape and hooks up with 3 neurotic hobos only to kill again.
I didn't know that one. That puts a whole different twist on that one.
Yeah, but we do that.
Yeah.
Our attachment for things to work out a certain way makes us twist the story.
Thank you for that.
All right, Shinjin and then Katsuryu. Oh, I'm sorry, Shikaku and then Katsuryu. And get really close, Shikaku.
Is this good?
Keep forward. Yeah.
Is this good?
Yep.
So, excellent talk. And as a scientist, we have many talks on art and music. We have fewer talks on science. So this really resonated with me. In fact, I made notes that I think I would like to write something on. And thank you so much for this. I have 3 questions. 1, in positivist thinking, you do not prove a fact, you disprove the null hypothesis. What then, Sensei, is a null hypothesis in Zen? 1. 2, if there is no self, can there be experimenter bias? And 3, if you meet a finding on the road, should you kill it? Thank you so much.
Okay, I think I've captured those. So that is very interesting. So thank you for the scientific perspective to prove or disprove a hypothesis. As those of us in the scientific world know, it's much easier to disprove a hypothesis than to prove one, because you can pick a specific case and disprove it, but to prove something requires actually disproving all the oppositional cases. So it's much more challenging. I think if I can kind of cheat and say, in our practice, it's a series of disprovings. Okay, I'm going to try this thing. If I get a new car, that will make me happy. Nope, I disproved that hypothesis. If I get a new partner, that will make me happy. Nope, I've disproved that hypothesis. Right? It's a lot of disprovings in our process, and I have to confess that it's been a long time since I've actually been in the scientific realm. I don't recall the exact meaning of the null hypothesis. I might ask you to come back to the microphone and remind me what that means so that I can try to answer that.
Well, as you know, in science, you can't prove anything because it would presuppose that you can understand every situation possible. So the workaround in Popperian logical positivism is you can't say something is, but you can say it is not, which is a very Zen sort of thing, right? So the null hypothesis, it's frequently believed to be if this is the hypothesis, it is misunderstood to say, therefore, the opposite, it is not this. But the reality is the null hypothesis says there is no relationship with nothing.
Right.
So null hypothesis is nothing, but not nothing, if you will.
Right. Thank you. So your second question, if there is no self, can you have experimenter bias? So that gets into that tricky discussion of, is there a self, is there not a self? And this comes to the risk in a very reductionist explanation. When people see no self, they go to kind of the nihilist, there is not a self. But that phrase refers to there is not an independent self, right? Obviously, there's a self that is the locus of our experience that we take through our daily lives. And the no self as principle is understanding that we don't do that as the separate entity that we think we are. So I think we can absolutely have an experimenter bias. And so, we have to be very careful about that. Otherwise, we would be an experimenter just lost in our delusions, not learning anything from the experiments, which comes back to the point Shinjin was making earlier. If you see a finding, kill it. Well, I think that is kind of the history of science, right? Is that we have an interim working hypothesis, and it may work for centuries, right? Like Newton's equations of motion worked for a few centuries until we got to the very, very large scales and the very, very tiny scales. And we saw that we had to add in some relativistic adjustments and some quantum adjustments. And then I think there are some developments now. I was looking at a YouTube talk very briefly the other day that talked about a new branch exploring new conceptual directions for theories of physics, as opposed to, a good example is, we've been in the kind of particle wave approach for so long, we have to kind of break out of that mold into other directions like string theory, which is kind of old by now. And the one I was reading about was kind of actually going beyond string theory. And I don't even remember the name of what that approach was called. But yes, we always have to be aware that a finding is temporary, is interim, right? Until we can penetrate a bit deeper.
Chikak says, thanks for your teaching. And I have Katsuryu, David, and then Inga.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk, Kosetsu Sensei. I don't have a scientific mind, but I've appreciated what you've had to say and the way you've expressed it. My experience with Zen, Zen frustration is that the practice never ends. I may get a result but it's like you just said, it's always temporary, and there's more to do. There's never really a resting point in the sense of, well, my work is done. I know it now. I can just, talk to everybody else about it, or something like that. So it was the indefinite progression or indefinite practice that I found to be difficult and have had to work with. Thank you.
And I think that can be frustrating for many people. And I think the way we frame it can lead to some of that frustration, not to find fault with your words, but it's very common when we say progression. It seems to be, progression implies towards a direction, right? And I fall into that all the time as well, because so much of our life is modeled that way. But when we look at concepts of practice enlightenment, right? And I'm kind of expanding that concept to more than just sitting on the cushion. But the concept there is that it's not a progression; it is just a continuous practice. And when you look at it as a continuous practice, it is easier to see that, yes, every day I'm going to wake up and there's going to be some kind of, quote unquote failures today, or frustrations today, or something like that. And that is my ongoing practice to deal with those. And when you can learn to look at it that way, and again, I'm not finding fault with your words. This is a struggle on my part as well. Every day, it's like, okay, I've just got to deal with this again today. One that I'm dealing with is, okay, I'm getting older. My body is changing, and there's not a progression there in terms of getting better, right? It's just a practice of learning to deal with what is day by day. That is a part of our continuous practice.
Thank you for your teaching again, Kosetsu. One question from David E. Doss from Facebook. How do you think you know when you have failed enough to now undetermined success? And then the other half of that, in other words, when you have experimented enough, I think of it as avoiding decision paralysis.
I'm just writing down the questions. How do you know when you failed enough to determine success? And what was the second one?
In other words, when have you experimented enough? And then he says, I think of this as avoiding decision paralysis.
Right. So one of the tricky bits about experimentation, and again, apologies to those who don't have a scientific background, right? But even those, for example, it doesn't have to be scientific, in design as well, and software development, things like that. The best experiments are those that answer or ask very specific questions, because very specific questions are the ones that give you actionable answers, right? If you try to ask, the broader the question you ask, the less useful the results, okay? So, like the famous, what's the answer to life, the universe, and everything? It's 42, if you know the reference, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So it's, the answer means nothing, but the question was just so incredibly broad, right? So the corollary to the fact that the most effective experiments ask very specific questions is that you never run out of experiments. There's lots and lots and lots of very specific questions that you can ask, and the results can add up to a broader answer. But just as in science today, engineering, things like that, there is no end to experiments. There are always more experiments to be performed. So one of the phrases that you hear scientists use quite a lot is that the more questions that we ask, the more we learn that we do not yet know, right? we are we are learning and at the same time expanding the realm of our ignorance, which sounds contradictory, very Zen. But so there, in my mind, there is no end to experimentation, especially in something as complex as human life. You know, the physics and science is easy by comparison. You know, you can model it in an equation and you have the answer. You put in the inputs, you get the outputs. But human life is much more complicated and messy than that. So I think the way to avoid decision paralysis is to, you know, going back to a principle we were talking about a few minutes ago, is understanding that all decisions are provisional, all answers are temporary, right? So once you realize that, I think one of the reasons we get into paralysis before making a decision is because if you look at the decision as being, okay, this is it, this is final, this is concrete, so I've got to get it right, that puts you under a lot of stress, which leads to the paralysis. Whereas if you look at it with all decisions are provisional, like, well, this will allow me to make some progress forward, and then this decision may have to change or adapt a little bit, but at least we can move ahead. And again, see, that's where we got into that path and directional type of, you know, things coming into our language. But again, we have to do that some for daily life. We have to eat, we have to have a place to live, take care of our families. I hope that answered the question.
Kosetsu, thanks for your teaching on that. And I'm just so excited to see all the Zen geek group on the call. And Inga is completes our group there. So, and she has a next question. So Inga, come off of mute, please, and ask your question.
Okay, thank you for reminding me to come off mute, because I was not going to do that. But yeah, so when you were talking about cognitive biases, and I use cognitive biases and logical fallacies a lot to kind of help me understand my own delusion of thinking. But there's also this logical fallacy of the middle ground, where, hold on, I'll pull it up real quick. You claim that a compromise or a middle point between two extremes must be the truth. And I kind of feel like that, you know, since we use the middle way in Zen Buddhism, that it feels like maybe we could sometimes fall into this logical fallacy that we have to like come to a compromise between 2 points. So what do you think about that? And is there a way to kind of prevent yourself from falling into that logical fallacy?
So I think, and again, I'm run the risk of reading too much into your words, right? But what I'm kind of envisioning is that a kind of linear Cartesian thinking of, you've got 2 points on line A and B, right? And the middle way is somewhere in between, which is yet another definite point, right? Whereas I don't see the middle way as taking an average or splitting the difference or something like that. It is really saying not A and not B. The truth is something else, but that doesn't mean, you know, A plus B divided by 2, right? So to the point we were talking earlier about null hypotheses, and it was a very scientific speech, but it's the same kind of thing where you can disprove a lot of things. It is hard to prove a thing, right? But still you're learning by disproving other things. So that's kind of the way I see the middle way. The Buddha, you know, is famous for not answering some questions by saying, well, if I had answered A, then the questioner would have had this understanding, which is wrong. And if I had answered B, the questioner would have had a different understanding, which is also wrong. By not answering, then I'm allowing that questioner to continue exploring this, because a lot of times the value is really in the questioning, not in the answer. So it's a continual struggle to find what is the middle way. You've heard me say this before, that, you know, Buddhist ethics is always situational. You know, you never get an easy answer. It's always, well, it depends. What is this precise situation at this time with these people? Does that somewhat address your question?
No, thank you. I know that makes a lot of sense. That it's not, the middle way isn't just the direct middle of any two sides. It's something different entirely.
Again, Cosette's, thanks for your teaching. I have a question from offline from Edge B. John. Bear with me. This might have been mentioned in the past, but I read a Stoic book by Ryan Holiday called The Obstacle is the Way, which explores the same idea. Stoicism and Buddhism have many similarities in the idea of using introspection to reach the person we wish to be enlightened. Have you heard of and researched Stoic philosophy before? If so, what is your general opinion? If not, will you look into it?
Excellent question. This is someone after my own heart in terms of, looking at things from different directions, a little bit of meandering there, comparing paths. I have, at various times over the years, heard some Stoic teachings and seen resonance there, similarities. I have never really studied it intentionally, so I can't claim any real knowledge there, except that I have noticed that before. I agree with the questioner, I believe, and it's something on my large list of things I would like to do, is to learn a little bit more about Stoicism, because I think there is some resonance there.
Thank you. Oh, you and Corolla, please. Corolla, if you're speaking, you're on mute. There you go.
I can never find the unmute tag. I love the idea of hypothesis testing. And just recently, I read a book by a Tibetan. It was called Why You Were Not a Buddhist. And it mostly scolded us a lot for being this or that. But there was one line in there that really struck me. He said, unless you intellectually accept the noble truths in your sitting, you might as well be a paperweight. And this really struck me because the noble truths are a model of how the world works. Just like Newton's laws are not laws that tell things what to do, it's our description of how the world works. And that's been tested and it's failed, at high velocities or whatever. We're still testing Einstein's theory of general relativity. We can always test this model of the Four Noble Truths and the precepts. And I think that's what you're talking about. And when we fail to find an alternative, that a new car makes me happy, or things are permanent, that reinforces our belief. And without having our intellectual mind engaged in the practice, then we're just buying things on belief and we're not truly engaged. Thank you for your teaching.
Thank you for that comment. It's not a surprise that you and I think kind of similarly, both of us with backgrounds in physics. I believe you stayed with it far longer than I did. I too really love the hypothesis approach, and one of the things that we are asked to do is to really critically examine ourselves and even our path. So I'm going to do that with our tradition a little bit here. Is that we place a lot of emphasis on meditation, on zazen, and I think sometimes we give short shrift to precepts work because the two work hand in hand, right? If you, again, that using the Four Noble Truths as a model of the world and testing that model, unless we think about them and kind of intentionally approach that, it's not going to happen. So I really see the two working together. We need to do it intentionally. I try to give a little bit more emphasis to precepts work. I don't mean more than Zazen. I just mean more than sometimes we see in a lot of our materials.
Apropos of nothing, Lawrence Krauss once ran a contest to find the best description of quantum mechanics in 5 words. And the winner was, look, particles, don't look, waves.
Yep. That's one of the, I would say that's a haiku that breaks the 575, but you know, it's so good that you can break the rules.
Kojo Sensei.
I'm going to wade in here between 2 physicists, so I'm likely to self-destruct. My understanding is to the 5-point look particle, don't look wave. My understanding is that the particles observe each other and that it doesn't require a human observer. And I'm going to take this back to Kosetsu to say all of Buddhism's teachings, while they include the teaching of the insentient and they include all sentient beings in their embrace, we have to admit that they're human teachings for humans. And so when we go to Dogen's analogy of the fish and the bird and their element, and if they don't move, they never reach the end of their element. And he goes on to say, they will not find their way or their place if they don't move. And then he goes on to say something very much like space-time or relativity. He says, if you find your place where you are, practice occurs, actualizing the fundamental point. If you find your place, or way, place where you are, and way at this moment, practice occurs, actualizing the fundamental point. So he's very clearly placing the onus on you and settling into your own position in space-time, and that's where practice can occur. So within that context, for human beings, we understand the water to the fish, the air to the bird. What is the human element in which we have to move in order to find what is the element?
So boy, that's the teacher's role to nail me with a specific question, right? So, but my answer to that is I really think that, you know, when you look at, for example, what I consider to be our criteria for evaluation, back to the hypothesis thing, I talk about the precepts, and I think that reveals the answer. I think our environment, our medium is interaction with others. I don't think it's a physical thing like air or water. I think it's moving in the human realm, dealing with other humans. Well, and I guess I'll expand that, you know, because if you could be in a situation with no other humans, just interacting with the phenomenal universe. But I think it really comes to its sharpest point in dealing with other people.
Yeah, the boundary between the personal and the social is where the rubber hits the road. But if you think of the elements, earth, wind, fire, and water, and this is, remember, 2,500 years ago, they did not have modern physics. And so they are developing all of this on an intuitive theoretical level, but without benefit of the information that we all benefited from in high school around modern physics. So some things we take for granted, they would consider fantastic or ridiculous, incredible, unbelievable. So remember, though, that it's not just the 4 elements. They would expand those elements to include space, consciousness, I think maybe even gravity, I don't recall. there's an expansion of the elements from the fundamental four. So amongst those 6 elements, earth, wind, fire, water, space, consciousness, what is the element that human beings are not aware of and must move in?
Out of those 6, what are the ones that we are not aware of and must move in? I'm going to have to contemplate that for a while. My gut reaction is to say that most of the day I'm not aware of my consciousness.
Good answer. The sutra we chanted in Chicago at the end of the know this, know that, it came to this, until we come to know consciousness also.
Thank you for both your teaching. And we have about 3.5 minutes. Last call for any final questions for Kosetsu Sensei.
If I could jump in for a minute. Human bodies, we can see a range of frequencies.
Corolla, can I
Here-
ask you to back? I think we missed the first part of your question.
Okay, Hojo was talking about versus science of 2,500 years ago, and things still fall down. We still only see the red to blue scale of the spectrum and hear certain frequencies. Quantum mechanics doesn't really have anything to do with our practice, other than to let us know that we only see a fraction of what is really there. But the reality for us as humans is still what we can see and what we can experience. That's my comment, and I'm not quite sure where I'm going with this, but I'm always leery of, other than the method of science, bringing scientific results into any kind of Zen argument, because, as you said, it changes all the time.
So
Thank
if
you.
I can, oh, you're welcome. Thank you for your question. To your comment earlier about apropos of nothing, rather than taking science to Zen philosophy, I had a neat example of Zen philosophy coming to science, although I really wasn't so aware of it at the time. In my undergraduate first class in quantum mechanics, I'm guessing we were a couple of weeks in, I don't know, don't recall exactly, but a professor that I really appreciated asked us one day, how many of you, he said, don't raise your hands, but how many of you think you get it? And he basically said, if you think you get it, you don't get it.
And Cosette, there is a comment, a question from Patty. What would our environment be change/flux? And I think you and Corolla kind of just talked about that. But did you see the comment it said, would our environment be change/flux?
That's an interesting question. I think that is a property of our environment, a very definite property of our environment. I don't know if that's the only one or the predominant one such that we would say that is the sole. I mean, obviously, it's a core teaching that things change, and that is part of what leads to suffering, because we naturally resist change. That's an interesting question.
What was the question again? By flux?
Is our environment change/flux? Change or flux? Our environment, is that
our medium in which we move?
I would say that our medium in which we move as humans I would posit that the medium in which we move as humans is, as far as anyone can tell, we're the only animal that's cognizant of the fact that we're going to die.
So that would be the ultimate awareness or of change to the question here.
I think we can see change with simply looking around. I don't think we need quantum mechanics or atomic transitions to see that all we have to do is look at the dust gathering on the shelves and see that everything is changing. And I think that's one of those things we can intellectually see when we're actually thinking about the noble truths.
I would bring it down to the so-called chronon or shana, the immediate moment. Not that we can perceive that or register that, but it indicates dukkha being change in the most neutral definition. Everything we experience is change. If you hear something, it means something changed, or you wouldn't hear anything. If you see something, it means something is changing, or you could not see it. Same for sensation. They're on different frequencies, but we're all that we are registering, you could say, all that our sense data is registering is fundamentally change.
Well, you could say that consciousness is a a series of state changes, right, in our mental models. So without change, we could not have consciousness.
Right, as long as you understand state not to be static.
And on that note,
Yeah, that's
Well,
good ending.
yes, yes. Kosetsu, thank you so much for your teaching, Kosetsu Sensei. And I want to just note that this is just the beginning of the conversation, because Kosetsu is going to be one of our featured, and I'll give him a second to speak about that, because I know he wanted to do a teaser. So please.
Thank you for the reminder. So, I see this as kind of the beginning of a discussion about the precepts, right? And if anybody wants to just dive into the precepts more, we conveniently have a precepts focused retreat coming up in 2 weeks.
Yes.
So I invite you to attend and pursue that discussion further.
Yes. So I think,
Thank you for the reminder.
Yeah, definitely. You're going to be leading that conversation on Saturday.
Co-leading. So we'll have 2 group discussions on precepts. So it will be Segetsu Roger Cochran leading the first session, and I'll be, I should say, facilitating, not so much leading the second session, where we'll have some initial discussion and then tee it up for a group discussion. We'll have breakout groups. So it should be quite fun, quite interesting.
Hojo Sensei?
Yeah, one other quick announcement in that context, just as Ungan Sensei was priest in residence here through April of this month, April of this year. Segetsu Roger Cochran will be here through June. And then Kosetsu is coming to be priest in residence this fall. And I can't remember the month Kosetsu.
It's September.
September. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We have that highlighted on the calendar, both June and September. So both of our priests in Ango will be doing several talks, and we'll have opportunities to meet with them and to interact with them during their stay. So we look forward to that. But again, Sensei Kosetsu, we are so grateful for your attention, your talk, and the time you have taken to be able to speak to the Sangha. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak. It has been a pleasure for your talk today.
Thank you.
And as always, just a few announcements. We kind of talked about that. The big thing for May is we have the retreat coming May 13th to the 16th. It is Vows in Bloom. Again, all that information is online. We got the teaser in the newsletter, and also you'll be getting another reminder email. Again, you do not have to participate in the whole retreat. We welcome folks to participate as they can. Your presence and your practice is greatly appreciated. Again, as always, we'll be having during that retreat, Keisei, who again, 2 of our Sangha members and our teachers have written books recently. So Keisei will be here. Hopefully we will talk a little bit about the meander, but also he'll be interviewing Hojo Sensei about his recent book. So during the Saturday part of the retreat.
The original frontier, I think, is the Kuasan is on tonight, and the last one, I believe, is scheduled to start in June as our Tuesday night reading. Kuasan, you might want to just confirm that. You might want to confirm that the original frontier will be the
Yeah,
for June, I think.
we're going to begin on June 8th and carry on through November. And the schedule will be up soon. So thank you. You're all invited.
Awesome. And next Sunday, it is going to be a community practice discussion co-facilitated by myself and Shishiki Brian Price. We'll be talking about, again, cultivating practice, which is an extension of also what Kosetsu was speaking about. And that'll get us, again, prepped and primed for our conference. We'll also be getting an update from Muman related to the Gasho newsletter and some of the feedback she's been receiving from that communication and that publication. And again, as always, Sangha, we're grateful for your support and your participation. It is only through your support that we're able to continue to offer the Zendo, support our teacher, and also allow us to bring the teachings online. So if you are, again, thank you so much. If you're already supporting, if you have not supported, we'll be grateful for you to consider to do that.
Do we have anything on reopening yet?
We don't. The board is meeting about that in May. We'll have more information to come on that. We have 3 people that are really focused on that. We are, again, I'm just going to hold any comments on that just because there's just been some discussion on the board and more direction will be coming about doing that safely. So again, as final comments, we are getting ready to close. We'll do our closing Dharma verses. So again, thanks everyone for your practice.
Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable. I vow to realize it.
That's everyone. Have a safe week. Be well. Thanks again, Kosetsu.
Dasho.